no, our basically the most simple sitting ground is, obviously through Descartes' search for a pure and foundational knowledge, come to something known as Cartesian Dualism, wherein there's the mind as a substance and the world or our substantive body, and there's a split between the two. And while Descartes employs some arguments to try and merge that split, especially arguments in relationship to God and such like that, the split has been a foundational feature of Western philosophy since Descartes, and I think for a lot of people that perspective has been before Descartes as well, but particularly he was the one that kind of brought that to the forefront, that there's basically you in your head, the thinking thing, cogito, and then there's the world out there. And the separation is distinct, and how you transcend the two or conjoin the two is a real challenge. It's a real philosophical challenge that people have been dealing with and struggling with for a long time. And then in the 20th century, along comes Heidegger, who wrote a lot, is very much associated with the existential and phenomenological tradition. And essentially his response to Descartes is that Cartesian dualism is based on a mistake in reasoning, mistake on understanding our fundamental ontological situation, and that there's a more primordial or originary way of being that Descartes is essentially missing out on, and that in a sense the dualism is an abstraction from how and what we regularly are. So, anyone else want to jump in there?
I have a question for you, Hale, about Cartesian dualism. And maybe you can help me understand this. Maybe I'm off base or maybe I'm onto something. But it seems like there's two senses of dualism. Mm-hmm. The first one is the traditional Cartesian dualism I learned about, which is the split between one's body and one's mind. So when I hear Cartesian dualism, I think about Descartes' claim, which has been a major theme and stuck through philosophical debate now for decades and centuries, that the human mind is not a physical thing, that the human mind is immaterial. So that I, as a single person, as one person, have an immaterial component, which entails my mind, my soul, that kind of thing. And then I have a physical component, which is my brain itself and the rest of my body. That's one sense of dualism. But now you're talking about another sense of Cartesian dualism, which is the sense that I, as a being, am distinct and separate from the world around me. So, and I think that latter sense of dualism is what Heidegger challenges. I'm not sure what Heidegger had to say about the mind-body dualism.
I think that the latter type you're talking about is more what Heidegger is getting at, but I think it's more the logical extension. The latter is more the logical extension of the former. That you've got is because for Descartes, we're trying to find certain knowledge. What's the only certain thing, right? And there's kind of a three-step move that Descartes is doing, but essentially the only certain thing he can come to is himself, and himself being not his physical body, not the world around him, but the fact that he right now in the present is thinking. Okay? And so then obviously the body, as your personhood and stuff, is more an extension of the external world in general, something that may, the obvious, or the classic example that Descartes uses is perhaps there's a demon, I'm asleep, or there's a demon tricking me, and da-da-da-da-da. The more modern example that people sometimes use is that we're just a brain in a jar. Right? How And if I'm a brain in a jar, then I know that in my mind I'm having these perceptions, I'm having these sensations, I'm having these internal thoughts, but I can't actually be sure, other than the fact that I'm experiencing them, that there's anything that corresponds to that experience.
Got it. So Descartes' claim that the only thing he can be sure of is that he's a thinking thing entails a separation between him as a thinking thing and everything else in the world, including everything else physical in the world, because he couldn't he logically he couldn't claim that I know for sure that I as a thinking thing exist because I'm thinking and doubting, but I don't know anything else exists. That logic entails a clear distinction between himself as a thinking thing and the rest of the world, and so that's where this rift comes from. The dualism that we're talking about and that Heidegger addresses comes from.
Yeah, and that's why I think a lot of people, and I can't remember if Descartes actually uses this language, but a lot of people have phrased it as like there's mind substance, right? There's body substance or world substance and mind substance. And that's the real split that Descartes finds himself in. Obviously, if people read like the Meditations and such, Descartes tries to find a way himself to get out of that hole, but those arguments are largely based around arguments for the existence of a good and caring God that wouldn't trick you and and to be, while this isn't a podcast about that, generally speaking, it seems that the philosophical tradition has not found those arguments particularly convincing. And so then we kind of get stuck, okay, well, it's sort of like the first part is convincing, right? The first part seems intuitive. I've kind of got it here, like the three parts is, in our everyday epistemic predicaments, we are seen as fundamental observers, collecting data about the world through the senses and forming beliefs about objects on that basis. And then from there, we end up essentially doubting so we are observing the world, but we end up doubting what we observe because our senses don't give us certain knowledge. And so then we're left with the conclusion that the result of that reduction is that the only certain thing is myself, the cogito, right? Or cogito.
And the implications of this, of Descartes' model here, are actually quite great, because if you think about it, it's really the basis of the major theories of knowledge that we use, that we have, that we accept in our society. So challenging Descartes' notions like this, I don't think that challenging Descartes' notion of mind-body dualism is a problem for theories of knowledge, but in the sense that that we would challenge Descartes' notion of sort of the second iteration of dualism, the one that I was describing, where and that you're describing, where I as a thinking thing am distinct and more certain than everything else out there in the world. To challenge that is to challenge the correspondence theory of knowledge, because a correspondence theory of knowledge that is widely accepted, and actually it's come up in politics. It's a current topic, right? It's been a hot topic, especially in American politics and in other places in the world where populist leaders and autocratic leaders try and construct their own reality. It's the progressive people, the liberal people, the defenders of democracy that say, no, we need to adhere to a correspondence theory of knowledge where truth is based upon correspondence to what is actually out there in the world. And that comes from Descartes, as you're describing Descartes' theory.
Yeah. Does anyone else have before we kind of like move forward? Does anyone else have anything they want to say? Jump in about Descartes or anything related to that?
I'm not nearly as well versed in Descartes as I am in Heidegger, so I think I'm gonna hold off. But like the bit I've looked into, kind of Descartes and his theories of reality, right? He does introduce with those 3 steps you pointed out, Hale. Kind of an interesting concept. that in order to fully be able to take in and receive information, we must first question that information, because that's where the analysis truly begins, right? And so then we go through this process of basically venting information to say, okay, this may be my perception, but is it truly reality as we can perceive it? But I'll be interested to weigh more on the Heidegger side of things for sure. But do you think, I mean, obviously I didn't do Descartes justice, but do you think I have like the basic like concepts of his analyzing of knowledge down?
I think totally, and I think that for Descartes, what makes Descartes so popular, and you're absolutely right, Mike, is Descartes has also been so foundational for, like, Descartes was such an important guy, not just in the philosophical realm, but also in the scientific realm, right? Because he laid the foundations of basically saying, there's you in there, you can use your senses to examine the world around you and figure out if, how closely what is going on in your mind corresponds to what you're observing, and from there you can build up and do science, and essentially move into what we would consider modern science. But we're still always left in the especially in the philosophical tradition, and people for like myself, and I'm sure a lot of people on this show, is one of the one of the first kind of cliche philosophy thoughts you have is like you're always left with that nagging feeling, like how do I know this is all real? Like, you're sitting in there, I know I'm thinking, but how do I know I'm actually doing this podcast right now? How do I know this is actually happening and it's not an illusion of one kind or another? And the Descartes model and the theories that grow out of that don't seem to be able to answer that question. And that's the thing that's kind of nagged people right from the time the Meditations was published, was that issue that came up, and that's kind of where Heidegger and his thinking starts to sort of come in and really reinterpret what Descartes is doing and the problems that he's dealing with. Tagen, is there something that you wanted to say to get us started on that response?
I mean, I'll be, like I said, I didn't prepare much for this, but I'll be interested to see how much we have to talk about Heidegger's concept of being in order to answer this question. Because dozing will enter into the formation of a individual's world, right, and how they go about reality. So, in order to answer this question of information analysis and kind of the response, I think it's probably important to just briefly touch on those concepts, because those are kind of central to the individual, at least in Heidegger's perspective.
Yeah. What you got any thoughts at this point, Mike?
I'm going to lay the groundwork for what you're going to go into. I think what you're going to go into by creating some suspense here by saying that I'm already skeptical and uneasy and nervous about anyone, including Heidegger, that would challenge the concept that there is an objective reality out there which is separate and distinct from human perception, and it's the role of humans, if we choose to do it, to discover what that reality is. So that's more or less the Cartesian view that I think you're about to challenge, or we're about to talk about Heidegger challenging that view. And I just want to say that I'm nervous. I'm nervous about it because I'm aware in general of the harm that can come and the danger that can come in the world when people lose sight of an objective reality and start to say that the reality is what we construct it to be. So prove me wrong. Ease my fears,
So
you
I
guys.
think,
Yeah.
yeah. So I, you know what? I think that's it's something that comes up a lot. And like first off, Heidegger is controversial for numerous reasons, particularly his own personal activities in his life. But when it comes to his philosophy, I think that so like the concern is that essentially we'll slump into some sort of relativism, right? That's always the big worry. And I think that when one takes time to try and really look at what Heidegger's getting at, what he's trying to do, that it, well, some people have sometimes accused him of doing that. I don't think on a closer reading that's really what's going on. What I think, so basically to go into it, Heidegger will say that, look, the split between subject and object, or between mind and body, or mind and material, is like I said in the intro, without getting into too much Heideggerian lingo and that kind of crap, which is honestly a whole other thing in itself. That is an abstraction from how we already are in the world, in the sense of, to put it, I'm trying to think about how to put it in the layman's words. What we are is the kind of beings that we are interacting with being, capital B, if you want to say that, is something that is absorbed in the world around us, right? The idea that like we're some sort of thing in my head separated from you, Mike, and separated from you, Tagen, I'm in here, and like that's that kind of little chatter that goes on there, right? That's who and what I really am is an abstraction from the fact that as a being, what I am is something that is interactive with the world, that is something that is activity, that is expressive, and that really isn't a thing, but is Heidegger and other people call it is an event, or is a happening. The flip side of that, though, is, and this is all a great simplification, is that who I am is thrown into the world. And we got to use a little bit of terminology there, but essentially, I don't pick when I was born. I don't pick where I live. I don't decide. But what's as a starting point, so many details about the world around me. But I show up here and participate and create within that context. So while there's a lot of freedom for me to build my own life, my world, and make decisions, the reality is compared to a lot of existential thinkers and people like that, Heidegger is much more focused on the limitations that we have in our creative abilities than on this ability to just sort of show up and, as you get down the line of other people, that sort of pseudo-relativism where like, because there is no actual external world external to me, I can just like pick and choose what is right, what is wrong, what things are. I think that is not at all what he's getting at. Instead, he's much more interested in the fact that as what I am, or as a person, as dozing, one cannot extricate oneself from the world around them. And I use the term world in the widest sense. Yeah. Hopefully we're getting a little bit at alleviating your fears, even if vaguely.
I'm curious to hear what Mark has to say, and also what Tagen, our Heidegger expert, has to say about Heidegger's view.
We won't put the term expert in the transcript. But before I get there, why don't I let Mark go first and see what his thoughts are?
All right. Well, this is a tricky subject. Well, and we haven't really talked about Heidegger's view, although I think it has to do with a phenomenological reduction. But I would find such a view in some sense unintuitive, or in a sense, in that we sort of, how do you say, have this intuition about that people do exist beyond our own, I guess, perception, right? You know, if I will send someone a text, right? You know, even if I don't see them or so on, and that maybe it's not quite what he's doing or something, but I feel like there's that sort of tension within such a reduction. So,
Are you talking about Descartes or Heidegger in the reduction?
No. What Heidegger's phenomenological reduction. Yeah.
I think that for Heidegger, much more than Descartes, one would say that I think Heidegger would basically say it's ridiculous to doubt that other people exist. It's ridiculous to doubt that the world exists. It's ridiculous to doubt, that what's going on around me is some sort of illusion. I think for him, it's very much clear that other people are real. The world around me is real. My culture is real. Our shared history and personal history is real. And those are all the elements that go into, as I know one writer has called it, the cross-section of who we are. Like, there isn't, and this is there's been much made of his relationship towards like Eastern philosophy, wherein there's real questions as to whether or not the self is even a thing. Heidegger, the self, kind of building on the Kierkegaard's words, for Heidegger, it seems much more like the self is a relationship, a wide context of relationships, none of which is independent of the world around it.
All right. So, if I may quickly respond before we get back to you, Tagen, the thing is, I don't see it as ridiculous to, I guess, doubt certain appearances, right? You know, we have dreams every night, right? And we experience, that our appearances are, in fact, seemingly, how would you say, misleading many times. And no one, is just sure about everything all the time. And so on. So it's sort of that whole experience which leads you to believe that there is something, in fact, external to just your own experience, I guess. Yeah.
Hey, let's hear what you have to say.
Oh boy! All right. Well, there's a lot there, obviously. But Hale, I think you did a. Obviously, you've read more than I have, so my hat's off to you there. But what I would say in terms of when we talk about Heidegger, it's what Hale has said. Heidegger isn't necessarily as concerned with kind of the groundwork as much as he's concerned with how we as individuals actually interact with our surroundings and with what we experience. Because in a sense, I think he takes the position that by virtue of our existence, we know the world exists. That's not necessarily a question for him. His question more is, and this comes back to something we talked about a long time ago when we talked about phenomenology and the three principles of phenomenology. And basically the third rule being the world in which you dwell arises out of fundamental commitment. So you have your individual experience, which shapes your worldview, your beliefs, politics, friends, so on and so forth. But within your world, you relate to others because of a certain commitment. So he is more focused, as Hale said, more on the relational aspect versus kind of dealing with the groundwork questions. I think you look at Dasein and how Dasein is being for Heidegger. So basically, Dasein's super complex, but basically you, basically something that drives your experiences. basically your personality, your inner self, which is not which is not physical. So I think you look at how that develops, right? Dasein is a temporal being. Dasein does die and become anew again when our worlds change. So you look at the concept of how we pass through time. Our childhood, for example. Our childhood is a world to itself. We can look back on our childhood and we can see formative moments, but we can't actually go back and interact with that. That's an epochal world for him. And each time that happens within our life, Dasein is stuck in that time, and it changes, it develops. So for him, it is very much the concept of dualism is very much tied to the individual's interactions with reality in the world itself, within an individual's understanding and framework.
I'm thinking about this, and it's one of like so many people like Heidegger and especially phenomenology. I always tell myself that I call it descriptive phenomenology because the work tends to be more about describing what it's like to exist, the phenomena of existence or the phenomena of being in one way or another of things. And one of the perhaps annoying elements of Heidegger and those sorts of people is they tend to try and make up their own language to describe that process, which then makes it very challenging to discuss and describe what their own descriptions of things. But I was thinking, when we think about Descartes, like Descartes thought that he had found something, the pure substance of the pure mind, right? Mind, substance, or soul, or whatever, and that was completely separate from the world and the potential illusions of the world. One of the simplest ways I think to get at what Heidegger is trying to go for is the philosophy of what's called internal relations, wherein the being of things, whatever they are, is not describable unto itself, right? So the classic example of an internal relation is if someone holds up, like a king from a chess set, it says like, what is this, right? What is this thing? You cannot properly describe and know what that thing is without understanding the game of chess, the rules, how it works, its significance within that relationship. What the chess piece is, and for Heidegger, what Dasein is a set of internal relations that defines the thing, the being. And there's no way to extricate that. There's no way to take that out and find some sort of pure knowledge separate from the world that it's related to. We are, in a sense, to get away from Dasein, it's simple to say we are our relationships, and those relationships occur on many, many different levels, whether they be personal, cultural, social, historical, equipmental, in terms of things that you do and act out. But to say that there's something internal there beyond that stuff is, for Heidegger, nonsensical. And that's exactly what Descartes is trying to get at, right? He's trying to, for him, all those relationships are potentially illusory. So, like that's the stuff we're doubting. I want to find something that's real. And in some sense, Heidegger is saying that like you're just making stuff up. You are what you do. You are who you are out in the world doing things, and you can't just and there isn't something to find internally there. That's kind of it. That's I think in many ways the response there. internal relations is an interesting. Actually it's something that I've become kind of interested in, that sort of thinking.
Yeah, I think even though we want to get away from Dasein, as I was thinking about kind of the nature of Dasein and how Heidegger looks at Dasein. Dasein, basically, Dasein's a blank canvas, and that's why Dasein reaches out to the world looking for experiences, looking for relationships, looking for social groups, looking for worlds to dwell in, because then it begins to be formed and developed. Right? Dasein is defined by Heidegger as possibility. Right? And as Dasein goes throughout the world, because its mission is quite simply to acquire knowledge and experience to then make basically value judgments on other possibilities. And the way Dasein does that is as it goes along, it has the ability to accept or reject possibilities based on its formation, but also at points in life, it can run across possibilities that it stumbles upon by virtue of just kind of going through life and having an incident which fundamentally changes it, for example. So to say that, I think where Descartes would say it's all kind of intellectual and it's all kind of pondering the big questions of am I really here? Da, 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 da. I don't know if Descartes accounts for those formative moments where there is that kind of bump in the road where you kind of are forced to re-examine kind of what your purpose is, what your desire is as you go through the world, right? What do you think, Hale? Or
I would generally agree with that. I think, and I'm interested to hear what Mark and Mike had to think. But one thing I'll say is, Heidegger is quite famous for saying that, the I'm trying to think of this. Sorry, it doesn't matter. But the essence of Dasein is existence, or to put it another way, being precedes thinking. So basically, we talked about our three stages of the Cartesian argument. Essentially, the first stage, according to Heidegger, makes a whole bunch of presuppositions that are only possible because they're being made by a being that already exists in the world. If there wasn't some primary state before stage one, or more primordial state before stage one, then you couldn't make that kind of abstraction in the first place.
Right.
I found a couple of great sentences in this paper that you distributed before the show that speaks right to this point, and I wanted to read them, but first I wanted to see if Mark wanted to add anything.
No, you can go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, okay. Heidegger criticizes the Cartesian tendency to take knowing as our primary way of interacting with things, because the problem arises of how this knowing subject comes out of its inner sphere into one which is other and external. In response to this traditional dilemma of subject as knower and object as known, so that's the dualism, the Cartesian dualism we've been talking about, Heidegger suggests that knowing is a founded mode of being in the world. So I'll stop right there, but I think that says a lot. Heidegger says that knowing is an experience of being in the world. It's not an intellectual process of discovering something in the outer sphere from within your separate inner sphere. It's actually being in that unified world. That's how I interpret
in a
that.
sense, oh no, I think that's pretty close in the sense of like, no, like we, especially in philosophy, especially Descartes, we tend to take knowing as, we almost put knowing up on a pedestal, right? We put thinking up above as some sort of like something beyond what we regularly do. But for Heidegger, knowing is just one more standard element of being the kind of beings that we are, right? You know what? Like there's the classic example that's used in his work, and I'll just, instead of thinking of another one, I'll just use it. But there's the classic example of using a hammer, building a house, right? I don't look at the hammer and see the hammer thing, and then like think about how it's a hammer thing, and go all through theories of using a hammer. I just, I use it. Right? I get out there and I start hammering nails, and I start putting timbers up and building a house, and I learn from prior experience, and also I learn from interacting with other people. And in fact, Heidegger would say that the whole theoretical attitude taken towards something like a hammer is a derivative from the actual position of using the thing as a or being in the relationship with the hammer as a tool. If that makes any sense. I know it can be kind of a weird way of thinking about it. In some ways, it's weird, but it's also very platitudinal in the sense of like, it seems kind of obvious. It's like, of course, you just kind of like use stuff.
I sort of get that. So the value in the hammer for me is not like intellectually knowing anything about it or knowing its physics or how it works. It's the experience of using the hammer to accomplish the task at hand. It's my relationship with that hammer and with the task that is my experience, and that's the knowing. It's knowing how this is to use this tool to accomplish the task. That's what counts, not some intellectual discovery about hammers.
And you use a very interesting phrasing there, which is actually, depending on translation of Heidegger, that is quite accurate, which is kind of a know-how with the hyphen in the middle. Translators love using hyphens to symbolize this singularity of these sorts of concepts, or the fact of what is most originary, how we standardly go about the world, is through a know-how, right? I don't theorize about living my day-to-day life. I just do it. I just exist in it. I move through it. I figure things out. When things are broken, Heidegger says it's usually when things don't work, when there's a roadblock in the way, that then we start theorizing. I pick up the hammer and suddenly the hammer breaks. Then I still start looking at the hammer. This is supposed to be a hammer. I'm supposed to be building a house. It's not working. That's again generally an abstraction of how we usually interact and know things, is more through a know-how of just participating or being in, as the Heideggerian phraseology would put it.
Yeah, I think maybe it's what you're saying. There's like different levels of, I guess, knowledge or theorizing, right? So like if I were to, perhaps just play the guitar, right, I wouldn't really specifically think about where each finger would go or which finger would pluck which string or so on. It just sort of would happen. And I my sort of feeling is that you do know in a way, on how to, I guess, play a specific song, right? It's not like something intellectual or like logical that you can sort of think out. It's more just learned. So I think you still have some knowledge or, theorize about it in some way.
And I think that's where that conception of knowledge is a know-how rather than knowledge as sort of pure reason comes in, right? And I think that like when we think about that example of playing the guitar, really like from the Cartesian model, there's some internal you substance that thinks that perhaps it's playing the guitar, and maybe it gets lost in the actual activity mentally of playing the guitar. But really, there's still that split there. Perhaps you playing the guitar part of what you're doing might not actually be real. Might be some kind of illusion. The only thing that we know for real is the experience of playing the guitar. Whereas Heidegger would say that no, that's really you. Like that's what you are. What you are is what you're doing, and it doesn't make sense to say that there's a potential separation there. To doubt that that's happening.
Well, I think that maybe this point sort of hits to what you said earlier when you talk about, sort of Heidegger's critique of Descartes. So sort of as I remember it, you're sort of saying that, even with Descartes' question, right, he makes a bunch of presuppositions, right, which of course, if you presuppose something, then when you're, when you're following arguments, you'll of course find your presuppositions. So like the I, right, and then perhaps a distinction between an external and internal world. However, as you said, just living, this being in the world, right, that in itself, I believe, leads to this, distinction between, how things seem and perhaps how things actually, are, despite what I think about them.
That I think that leads into a wider discussion of, I'm trying to think about the best way to say this, because what we are as Dasein, or we'll just use like who and what we are, is a set of internal relations. The biggest relation that we have is the relation to our community at large, which is often translated as like the they, or I think the actual German is das Man, which it becomes a very classic existential theme, right? That there's the mass, the undefinable mass of the human community that pushes and pursues people along, and I think Heidegger would say that most of our interpretations, because what we fundamentally are is beings that interpret the world around us, most of our interpretations are not actually our own, are given to us by the community that we're immersed in. And that, like you're kind of saying, figuring out more truth or more honest or dishonest views, perceptions of the world, has a lot to do with a relationship with the community at large. And also that process is sometimes, this is getting into the historical element of Heidegger, but that perception is a lot of times is defined by our historical situation, for lack of a better saying it. So think about it. One way might be, that in medieval times, that the world was flat and very small was simply incorrect, but was the only interpretation that was accessible to the people that lived there in that period, and that's an example of something that's given to you by your wider community, and it might be a perception or interpretation that you have, but really can't be said to be one's own.
So I found another passage in this paper, a couple of sentences which I think are very explanatory. Heidegger rejects the traditional theory of knowledge, which is generally based on the distinction between subject and object. So we've been talking about that. But now this is really good. Since knowing has the phenomenal character of a being which is in and towards the world, knowing is already alongside its world, i.e., knowing is grounded beforehand in a being already alongside the world. So I think what is being said there is that it's logically impossible to know anything about the world without being part of it. And that contradicts the idea that there's a separation or a distinction between the outside world, which can be known, and me, the observer, which is trying to know it, because I'm already part of it when I'm trying to learn something about it. So it's impossible, put it another way, put it sort of in the negative, it would be impossible to know anything about the world without me observing it. I don't know what the world would be like if I wasn't interacting with that world. So if I'm interacting with it, which is a requirement for me, I must do that in order to learn something about it. That's all I know. I don't know what it's like without me. Now, some scientists might refute that.
Yeah, well, and I think that this is, and I know we've mentioned this before, but a big part of Heidegger is also to the fact that the world wouldn't be anything. What the world, and this is why really, like, the main thing is being in the world, because what the world is cannot also be separated from you or us, right? In the sense of, like, if there was no Dasein, there would be no world. Right, and that's not a rejection of, like, that. Like, look, like, my personal beliefs of this: if everybody just died suddenly, there would still be physical stuff. But what that stuff is, as meaningful entities, where, my phone in front of me, the stars that we study, the earth below this building, the fact that those things are what they are is because they are part of the internal relationship of us and them together here doing this world that we can't extricate ourselves from. It's always already happening.
So that fits nicely with theories that colors aren't in the object, but they're in the perceiver's experience, or I mean, there's a big debate about that, right? Like, I see a green tree. Is the color green in the tree, or is the color green an experience that I'm having? It sounds like it would be more consistent with Heidegger. I mean, I don't want to speak for Heidegger, but if I were to I would make an argument that Heidegger's theory would fit more closely with the idea that the experience that I'm having is an experience. It's not intrinsic to the world out there. And I'm assuming that Heidegger did not, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming Heidegger didn't deny the existence of matter. He wasn't he was maybe a German idealist, but not.
No.
He wasn't an idealist in the sense of idealism, which some people were, which suggests that nothing is real other than the immaterial. I don't think Heidegger denied the existence of matter, but he denied that you could know matter. He said you could not know anything about that matter without interacting with it.
I think, yeah, and I think one way of putting it is what he would deny is the meaningful existence of matter independent of us. Right? So I don't think that like those sort of hard idealist questions are things he even really, like, dealt with particularly. Just from my perspective, it's not something he's really interested in. Like, and from my reading, he never went around and said the world doesn't exist. Like, it's just all in our heads. Like, definitely not. You mentioned that, like, he would think that the color would be more in the experiencer. I think what he would say is rather that the color is a part of being in the world. It's part of the relationship of the experiencer and the object together, inseparable as that phenomenal relationship is. And that you can't say that the experience, the color is just in the experience, and you can't really say that the color is just in tree. It's in the relationship between the two.
Well, here's a question I have for you guys to ponder. Let's not posit that every human being is gone or dies. Is there anything left in the world to be experienced, or is it just a bunch of stark cold matter? Let's go further than that and say, if even one person dies, if I die, is there anything out there? Granted, there's still matter, but would matter even be? Can we even say, without a perceiver, without a human interactor, without me interacting with that matter, would it be anything other than matter? And in matter in the simplest, starkest form, with no meaning whatsoever.
I think it's just an aside. I don't think that he would. I kind of would take this view too. I wouldn't deny that there's the matter in that context, and I also wouldn't posit that there's matter in context. You can't. It's one of those things where it's like you can't. It's like there's nothing to say. Essentially, I wouldn't, like, deny that there's there's if no one existed, that suddenly that the matter would disappear. But I also wouldn't posit that that's the case either. As to your question about individuals and their disappearance, Tagen, why don't you? Do you have something you want to say about that?
Oh man, what happens if an individual dies? Can you reframe the question so I have a more direct line to answer here?
Basically, if everybody dies, then do things still exist is one question. If you were to die or Mike was to die, just as one individual, do things still exist independent of them?
I think Heidegger would say your own individual. I can't talk anymore. Your own individual world dies, but the physical matter within it remains, because your world and the way you experience reality is fundamentally shaped by your Dasein. That doesn't mean that material matter disappears, because it is separate from your experience. By virtue of you relate to that matter as you perceive it. The matter itself it's not a reciprocal relationship where it needs you to perceive it for it to exist. Actually, you need it to exist, because if you didn't, you would have no frame of reference for the world and stuff like that. So I think it remains. Now, as to the question of meaning, that's a more tricky question, because then you have to deal with like if an entire culture dies out, has meaning been lost, right? We can debate that as it comes to something like language. When a language dies out, which makes up a culture, a population of people, that meaning and that stuff passes away. So I think there's layers to this question. I don't know if that explanation helped at all, but I think Heidegger would say that if I was to die, it wouldn't change anything. Now, if an entire people group died, the material would still be there, but the way it is perceived and understood would be lost.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Heidegger would say, but what I'm thinking is that it's logically impossible to posit what would happen or what would be left or what meaning there would be left or what look or feel would be left to matter if all humans were to die, because then we're negating the fact that there's other living things. There's animals and they're perceivers also. And then we'd have to say, well...
But we don't know that.
Well, we don't know. We have a lot of... Sure that we know that. We don't know to what extent. We know that they perceive. They have senses. They have sense perception. And
okay, fair enough.
So even if all humans died, then there would be animals that were perceivers. And if all animals died, then there'd be plants that were perceivers. If all plants died... it doesn't make sense. I think the only way to be consistent is to argue that that each world, that each person lives in his or her world.
Yeah, and I think so. And I think that's kind of the answer that Tagen was getting at, and that is that, when we say being in the world, I think another way to think about it is being in the worlds, that Heidegger is very much conscious of the fact that each of us has our own world, right? And that we can kind of think about it like each individual world is a very, very slight articulation of a wider shared human context, right? And that context is generally historical and cultural. So, for example, like if I had a car, let's say I was rich and owned my dream old Ferrari, right? Old 60s Ferrari. And I loved that car. And there were ways that I looked with and interacted with that car, and that car had a meaning for me that was individual and really special. And I die. It's not like that car stops being a Ferrari for you three. You guys go into my garage, you see the Ferrari.
Yeah, but you don't know that. That's only in your world. So listen, this is really important. So when I read in the news about things happening, or I hear from historians about the way the world was, and I talk to you, Hale, and I talk to you, Mark, and I talk to you, Tagen, and I hear about your worlds, I'm experiencing all that in my world. It's my world. So you guys are in my world. And what historians say and what I read about and what I learned in school is all part of my world. I have no way of if I die, then that world is gone.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I'm saying. Is that if I die and then you guys come and you guys go to my garage, you see my Ferrari, it's still going to be a Ferrari. My Ferrari, the one that I experienced, that was a part of my world, that I had that special relationship with that car, that's gone. It's not there anymore. That's not a part of your guys' experience.
So Hale, just really quickly to clarify that, are you saying that the car in its material form, the car in its physical form is still present, which we can probably agree upon, but kind of the essence of the car, the experiences of the car are then lost because those are bound.
Particular attitude or dispositions towards the car. As it appears. But I wouldn't even say the car. Like it's not so much that the material car is still there present, but what's more important is the shared cultural object. Right, the parts of the car that we do share. The fact that it's a Ferrari, it's a car, it's red. Assuming we all perceive red color the same way, right? But those parts are still there in the cultural and social shared implications.
But when you sort of posit this material car that's not really part of this historical or shared car, then it sort of does sound like you're going back to this dualism again, where it's there's this.
I wouldn't say that you're divorcing. My impersonal interpretation is not divorcing itself from the shared one. It's sort of it's more of an outgrowth of that shared interpretation. I think we're coming very close to our end.
Yeah, we could go on forever, but I guess we have to wrap it up. Well, we should do a part 2 at some point, yeah.
All right, does anybody have any ending comments they'd like to make? Take us out?
I think Heidegger and Descartes were both kind of right, but I'm always going to side on Heidegger in this point to say that at the end of the day, whether we're thinking or not, whether this is real, doesn't really matter. That's a question to ponder.
Awesome, Tagen. Well, thanks you guys for all being here tonight. That was a fun little discussion. And hope you guys have a nice night. And thanks for listening to the podcast.